Since the earliest days of recorded history, powerful hands have tried to bury inconvenient truths, but this story proves one thing beyond doubt. History can lie, records can disappear, but truth has a memory that cannot be erased. In the early decades of the 19th century, on a vast southern plantation surrounded by endless fields and tall, watchful trees, there lived an enslaved woman whose true name was never written down. Names, after all, were not considered important for people like her. She was called whatever the master or overseer decided to call her, and sometimes she was not called at all, only summoned by a sharp voice or the crack of a whip. She had been brought to the plantation when she was still very young, torn from any memory of family or home, and raised under a system designed to erase identity and replace it with obedience. From sunrise to sunset, her life followed the same exhausting rhythm, working the fields, hauling heavy loads, cleaning, cooking, and serving, always under the threat of punishment, always under watchful eyes that saw her as property rather than human. The plantation itself was a world built on cruelty disguised as order. The big house stood tall and proud at the center, a symbol of wealth and authority, while the slave quarters were cramped, cold in winter, suffocating in summer, and filled with quiet suffering. The woman learned early that silence was safety. Speaking too much, asking questions, or showing emotion could bring pain. Like many enslaved women, she carried not only the physical burden of forced labor, but also the constant fear of violation. Her body did not belong to her, it belonged to the system, to the master, and to anyone he allowed access. This was a reality so common that it was rarely spoken of, yet it shaped every moment of her existence. As she grew into adulthood, her strength became noticeable. She was resilient, capable of enduring long hours of work without complaint, and this made her valuable in the cruel calculations of plantation life. But her value was not limited to labor alone. Enslaved women were often seen as tools for reproduction, a way to increase the number of enslaved people and, in turn, the wealth of the owner. The woman understood this long before she ever became pregnant. She had seen other women in the quarters carry children conceived in violence, watched them give birth with little help, and then return to work soon after, their pain ignored. She knew that motherhood under slavery was not protected or celebrated. It was another form of bondage. The master of the plantation was a powerful man in his community, respected by his peers, and known for his outward display of manners and refinement. To the outside world, he appeared disciplined and honorable, a man who upheld tradition and order. Within the boundaries of his land, however, his authority was absolute. His word was law, and no one dared to question it. He viewed the enslaved people as assets, numbers on a ledger, bodies to be used for profit. The woman came to understand that her fate was tied not to her actions or character, but to the desires and secrets of men far above her in the social hierarchy. Her life changed irrevocably the first time she realized she was with child. There was no celebration, no protection, and no concern for her well-being. The pregnancy was simply acknowledged as a fact, another development to be managed. She continued to work until her body could no longer bear the strain, and even then, rest was minimal. When the child was born, it was quickly taken from her arms, not forever at first, but enough to remind her that even her role as a mother was not hers to control. She loved the child fiercely, silently, knowing that love was the only thing slavery could not fully take from her. This pattern repeated itself, slowly at first, then with terrifying regularity. Pregnancy followed pregnancy, years blending together in a cycle of labor, childbirth, and loss of strength. Each time, her body endured trauma that was never allowed to heal, yet she survived, not because she was spared suffering, but because survival itself became an act of resistance. She learned to move through life with a quiet endurance, protecting her children as best she could, even though she knew that at any moment they could be sold, beaten, or taken away. The fear of separation haunted her more than hunger or pain. What made her story especially haunting, though, was not just the number of children she bore, but the circumstances surrounding their conception, circumstances she could never speak of openly. She lived under constant observation, yet some truths hid in plain sight. The plantation had visitors, family members of the master who came and went, men who carried the same authority and expectation of silence. The woman understood that her suffering was tied to secrets meant to be buried, secrets protected by power and reinforced by violence. She had no voice in these matters, only a body that bore the consequences. Despite everything, she retained a sense of humanity that the system worked tirelessly to destroy. She remembered small details, the sound of wind through the trees at night, the warmth of her children when she held them close, the shared looks among other enslaved women who understood her pain without words. These moments were fleeting, but they reminded her that she was still alive, still human, even when the world around her denied it. Her existence became a quiet testimony to resilience, a life lived under unimaginable pressure yet not completely broken. As years passed, her youth faded, replaced by deep exhaustion and lines of hardship etched into her face. She became a familiar figure on the plantation, known for her endurance, her silence, and the growing number of children connected to her name, or lack of one. To the master, she was an asset that continued to produce value. To the enslaved community, she was a symbol of both suffering and strength, a woman who carried the weight of the system on her body. No one could change her fate, but many recognized the injustice written into every step she took. Her story, like so many others, was never meant to be remembered. The system of slavery depended on forgetting, on erasing the lives it destroyed and reducing them to statistics or property records. Yet her life mattered, even if history refused to record it properly. Before the shocking truths connected to her children would ever come to light, she had already endured decades of exploitation, her identity stripped away piece by piece. She stood at the center of a hidden tragedy, one that would later reveal the deep hypocrisy and moral rot at the heart of the plantation world. Even in silence, her life was already telling a story the world would one day be forced to confront. As the years passed, what first seemed like isolated tragedies began to form a disturbing pattern that no one on the plantation could completely ignore. The woman's pregnancies continued with relentless regularity, each one arriving before her body had recovered from the last. Seasons changed, overseers came and went, crops failed and prospered, yet her condition remained the same, either heavy with child or recovering from childbirth while already being pushed back into labor. Among the enslaved community, quiet conversations began to circulate late at night, spoken in whispers so soft they barely carried beyond the walls of the quarters. It was not only the number of children that shocked them, but something far more unsettling that appeared with each birth. At first it was dismissed as coincidence. One child bearing a certain facial structure meant nothing, two could still be explained away. But as more children were born, the resemblance became impossible to deny. The shape of the eyes, the angle of the brow, the curve of the lips, again and again, the same features appeared. They did not resemble the master, whose bloodline they were legally claimed to belong to. Instead, they looked uncannily like another man, a man whose presence on the plantation was frequent and whose authority was nearly as strong as the master's himself. The resemblance was so precise that even those who dared not speak of it openly began to exchange knowing glances. The enslaved woman noticed it too, long before anyone else dared to acknowledge it. As a mother, she studied her children's faces with an intensity born of love and fear. She saw the similarities clearly, but understanding them brought no comfort. It only deepened her sense of entrapment. She knew that true. In her world was dangerous. To recognize it silently was one thing, to voice it was another entirely. She learned to school her expressions, to keep her eyes lowered, and to act as though nothing unusual existed, even as her own children became living proof of something deeply wrong. Within the household, tension slowly thickened like humid air before a storm. Servants whispered behind closed doors. The mistress of the house noticed what others noticed, though she pretended not to see it. Denial became a survival strategy for everyone connected to the master's name. To admit the truth would mean exposing a secret capable of shattering reputations and inviting scandal, something far worse than cruelty in a society built on appearances. So the children were labeled, counted, and recorded as property, their faces ignored, their origins officially unquestioned. The woman's body became the silent center of this growing unease. Each pregnancy brought her closer to physical collapse, yet no one intervened. The system had no concern for her health, only for the continuation of control. She labored in the fields with a swollen belly, gave birth with minimal assistance, and returned to work while still bleeding and weak. Her pain was normalized, expected, and dismissed. Still, she endured, not because she was unbreakable, but because breaking was not permitted. Survival was not a choice, it was an obligation forced upon her. As the number of children grew, so did the danger they represented. They were not just enslaved laborers in waiting, they were evidence. Their faces told a story that contradicted the carefully constructed narrative of honor and authority maintained by the master's family. Some of the older children began to notice it themselves as they grew. They compared their features to others around them and sensed that they did not quite fit. Questions formed in their minds, but questions were unsafe. The mother discouraged curiosity, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. She knew that knowledge without power could destroy them. The plantation's enslaved community responded in different ways. Some treated the children with extra care, recognizing the danger they carried simply by existing. Others kept their distance, afraid that proximity might bring punishment, envy, resentment, sympathy, and fear all mixed together in a place where survival depended on staying unnoticed. The children did not receive any special treatment from the master. If anything, their presence seemed to irritate him, as though they were reminders of something he wanted buried. They were worked hard, disciplined harshly, and reminded often of their place. Meanwhile, the man they resembled moved freely through the plantation, his authority unquestioned, his actions shielded by privilege. He spoke politely in public, discussed business with ease, and carried himself with confidence. His role in the woman's suffering was never acknowledged, never named. Power protected him completely. The woman understood this imbalance better than anyone. She lived with the knowledge that the truth of her children's origins existed only in the shadows, where it could not challenge those in control. Time moved forward, indifferent to justice. The woman aged prematurely, her body worn down by repeated trauma. Her pregnancies became harder, the births more dangerous, yet they did not stop. Each new child added weight to the secret, making it heavier, more visible, and more terrifying. Still, no one intervened. The plantation continued to function as it always had, feeding off silence and obedience. The master's wealth grew, his standing remained intact, and the cost was paid in the flesh and lives of those beneath him. Despite everything, the woman continued to love our children fiercely. Love was the only rebellion she could afford. She whispered comfort to them at night, taught them how to endure pain quietly, and warned them subtly of the dangers of drawing attention. She knew she could not protect them forever. Sale, separation, and punishment were constant threats. Yet in her heart she held on to the belief that their existence mattered, even if the world insisted otherwise. As the pattern became undeniable, it also became unspoken law. Everyone knew, yet no one spoke. Silence settled over the plantation like a heavy fog, obscuring truth while allowing injustice to thrive. The woman lived at the center of this unacknowledged reality, her life reduced to a series of violations hidden behind respectability. Her children grew up not knowing the full truth, but feeling its weight in every harsh command and every watchful glance. Together they embodied a secret too dangerous to expose, and in doing so, they revealed the deep corruption that lay beneath the surface of plantation life. A corruption sustained by power, fear, and the deliberate erasure of the humanity of those who suffered the most. The man whose face appeared again and again in the children's features moved through the plantation like a permanent shadow, never fully seen yet always present. He was the master's brother, bound by blood to the highest authority on the land and protected by that connection in ways no one else could ever hope to be. He arrived and departed without question, sometimes staying for weeks, sometimes vanishing for months, but always returning as though the place belonged to him as much as it did to his brother. He spoke with education and restraint, presenting himself as reasonable, even kind, and this careful performance only deepened the silence around him. People learned quickly that to acknowledge his power was safer than to question it. From the woman's perspective, his presence was a constant source of dread. She learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps, the way the air seemed to tighten when he entered a space. His authority did not need to be announced, it was understood. No one interfered when he gave orders, no one asked why he lingered where he should not have lingered. The boundaries that were rigid for everyone else did not apply to him. For the woman, this meant that there was no refuge, no place on the plantation where she was beyond reach. Even the quarters meant to house the enslaved away from the big house offered no real protection when power chose to cross that line. What happened between them was never spoken of, not because it was unimportant, but because speaking would have invited destruction. The woman understood that her survival depended on silence. Resistance would not bring justice. It would bring punishment, perhaps death, and certainly suffering for her children. She endured what she had to endure, locking her pain inside herself and letting the world see only obedience. The brother's reputation remained untouched, his public image carefully maintained, while the consequences of his actions were carried entirely by her body. As time went on, the resemblance between him and the children grew sharper, more undeniable. It was not just one feature or another, but an entire expression, a presence in their faces that mirrored his own. Some of the children inherited his quiet intensity, others his sharp gaze, and as they aged, the similarity became harder to dismiss. Even visitors from neighboring plantations noticed it, though they were careful to keep their observations vague. In a society built on appearances, everyone understood when not to look too closely. The master himself could not have been unaware. He saw the children every day, watched them grow, and lived the constant reminder of his brother's betrayal and the shame it carried. Yet acknowledging it openly would have meant admitting to a violation of the moral order he claimed to uphold. Instead, he chose denial. He treated the children harshly, as though punishment could erase resemblance, as though cruelty could silence the truth written to their faces. His anger was never directed where it belonged. It was safer to aim it downward. Within the household, the tension between the brothers was subtle but persistent. Conversations ended abruptly when certain subjects arose. Long looks were exchanged, filled with unspoken accusation and resentment. Yet neither man broke the silence because both benefited from it. The brother retained his freedom and status, and the master preserved his public honor. The cost of this unspoken agreement was borne entirely by the woman and her children, who existed as living proof of something everyone pretended did not exist. The enslaved community watched all of this unfold with a mixture of fear and grim understanding. They knew how power worked, how truth bent under its weight. Some pitied the woman deeply, recognizing the injustice she endured. Others feared being associated with her too closely, worried that the attention surrounding her children might bring danger to anyone nearby. Survival often demanded emotional distance. Still, quiet acts of solidarity appeared in small ways: a shared piece of food, an extra moment of rest granted without permission, a watchful eye kept when the brother was near. As the children grew older, the danger shifted. Infants could be dismissed as property, but adolescents raised questions simply by existing. Their height, their posture, the way they carried themselves, everything about them echoed a lineage they were never meant to reveal. The woman sensed the growing risk and felt an unrelenting fear settle into her bones. She warned her children to keep their heads down, to speak only when spoken to never meet the brother's eyes. She understood that resemblance could provoke cruelty as easily as it provoked shame. The brother, for his part, behaved as though the children were invisible. He neither acknowledged nor denied them, maintaining distance that protected his conscience, if he had one, and his reputation. When he passed them in the fields or the yard, his expression never changed, yet his presence lingered in their lives like a curse. The woman could feel the weight of his indifference almost as heavily as the weight of his earlier violations. Both were forms of power exercised without accountability. Years of this quiet terror took their toll. The woman's health deteriorated, her strength fading, her spirit worn thin. She aged faster than time alone could explain, her body carrying scars both visible and hidden. Still, she continued to work, to give birth, to endure. There was no reward for her suffering, no acknowledgement of her humanity. The system required her silence, and she gave it, not because she believed in it, but because she wanted her children to live. In rare, private moments, she allowed herself to feel anger, not just at the men who controlled her life, but at the world that accepted their behavior as normal. She understood, in her own way, the hypocrisy that defined the plantation. The same society that spoke of honor and virtue relied on exploitation and secrecy to sustain itself. Her children were proof of that contradiction, flesh and blood evidence that morality was selectively applied. As the brother continued to move in and out of their lives, untouched by consequence, the woman realized that justice, as defined by the world she lived in, would never come for her. Truth did not guarantee freedom, it threatened destruction. And so she chose endurance over exposure, silence over speech. Her life became a study in survival under impossible conditions, a constant negotiation between fear and love. By the time the plantation entered a new phase, with changing economic pressures and shifting social winds, the damage had already been done. The brother's shadow remained long and dark, stretching across decades of the woman's life and shaping the fate of every child she bore. Though no record would ever officially link him to them, his presence was etched into their faces, their bodies, and their suffering. The woman lived with this knowledge every day, carrying a truth that could never be spoken, knowing that her children's very existence exposed a lie at the heart of the power that ruled them all. As the children grew older, their lives became shaped not by childhood innocence, but by the harsh realities that awaited them from the moment they could walk and work. From an early age, they were assigned tasks meant to harden their bodies and break their spirits. The boys were sent to the fields, their small hands gripping heavy tools, their backs bending under burdens far too great for their years. The girls were trained for domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, and serving, their movements closely watched, their behavior tightly controlled. None of them was spared, and none were allowed to forget that they were considered property first and human second. Their shared blood meant nothing in a world that measured worth only through ownership. Despite carrying the unmistakable features of powerful men, the children inherited none of the privilege that blood was supposed to grant. Instead, their resemblance became a silent curse. Overseers watched them more closely, suspicious and uneasy, as though the children's very faces challenged the rigid order of the plantation. Any sign of confidence or intelligence was quickly punished. The master seemed especially harsh with them, as if cruelty could erase the truth written into their features. His discipline was not corrective but vengeful. Driven by shame and anger, he refused to acknowledge openly. The mother lived in constant fear of separation, knowing all too well how easily families were torn apart. Slave sales were common, and children were often sold without warning, traded to settle debts or increase profits. Each time a trader arrived or the master spoke of financial concerns, her heart tightened with dread. She memorized her children's faces, their voices, the way they laughed quietly when they thought no one was listening, afraid that any moment might be the last time she saw them together. Love in her world was always shadowed by loss. Some of the children were eventually sold, their departures sudden and brutal. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, only the cold efficiency of a system that treated lives as commodities. The mother watched as sons and daughters were led away, their confusion and terror reflected in her own helplessness. Each separation left a wound that never healed, yet she was expected to continue working as though nothing had happened. Grief was not permitted. Mourning was a luxury reserved for those with power. She carried her sorrow in silence, adding it to the growing weight she bore every day. Those who remained faced a different kind of imprisonment. They grew up under constant scrutiny, reminded repeatedly of their place through harsh words and physical punishment. Any hint of resemblance to the men of the big house seemed to provoke harsher treatment, as though their faces were acts of defiance. The plantation became a cage where identity was both denied and weaponized against them. They were told they were nothing, yet treated as threats simply for existing. This contradiction shaped their understanding of the world, teaching them early that justice was not designed for people like them. The mother tried, in whatever small way she could, to protect what remained of her family. She taught her children how to survive, when to speak, when to stay silent, how to avoid drawing attention. She warned them against meeting certain eyes, against standing too tall, against showing curiosity about things beyond their assigned roles. These lessons were not meant to break their spirits, but to keep them alive. Survival, in her experience, required constant self-denial. Even pride had to be hidden. Among the enslaved community, reactions to the children were complex. Some offered quiet kindness, understanding the danger surrounding them. Others kept their distance, fearful that association might invite punishment. The plantation thrived on division, and mistrust was one of its most effective tools. Still, in moments of shared labor or late-night conversations, there were gestures of solidarity that reminded the children they were not entirely alone. These moments, though brief, were essential. They allowed a sense of humanity to survive in a place designed to crush it. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, the children began to fully understand the boundaries imposed upon them. Dreams of freedom or escape were whispered but rarely pursued, crushed by the overwhelming force arrayed against them. They saw what happened to those who resisted: beatings, imprisonment, disappearance. Fear became a constant companion. Yet beneath that fear, there was also an unspoken awareness of injustice, a recognition that their suffering was not accidental but deliberate. This awareness did not grant power, but it shaped their inner lives, giving meaning to their endurance. The mother watched her remaining children age with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She saw strength in them, resilience forged under relentless pressure. At the same time, she mourned the lives they might have had in another world, one where their existence was not a crime and their faces were not evidence of shame. She understood that slavery had stolen not just her freedom but their futures. Even so, she continued to love them fiercely, refusing to let the system extinguish that bond completely. Her own body bore the marks of decades of exploitation. Years of childbirth and labor had left her weakened, her movements slower, her pain constant. Yet she was rarely granted rest. The plantation did not slow for age or injury. She worked until exhaustion became normal, until pain was simply part of living. Still, she persisted, driven by the instinct to remain alive for the sake of those who depended on her. Each day she survived felt like a small defiance against a system that expected her to break. The children, now grown, carried their own burdens. They understood that their mother's suffering was tied to their existence, and this knowledge filled them with both gratitude and guilt. They tried, when possible, to shield her from additional labor, to offer small comforts within their limited power. These acts, though minor in the larger scheme, mattered deeply. They represented love expressed under impossible conditions, proof that even slavery could not entirely erase human connection. As time moved on, the plantation itself began to change. Economic pressures, shifting laws, and growing tensions in the wider world hinted at transformations to come. Yet for the woman and her children, these distant changes offered little immediate relief. Their daily lives remained bound by the same rules, the same dangers, the same silences. Hope, if it existed at all, was fragile and cautious, never spoken aloud. Through it all, the children stood as living contradictions. Descendants of power who lived in chains, reminders of hypocrisy that no one dared confront. Their lives exposed the moral emptiness beneath the plantation's polished surface. And at the center of it all stood their mother, a woman whose body had been used, whose voice had been silenced, yet whose endurance kept her family alive as long as it could. A story, woven into the suffering and survival of her children, revealed the true cost of a system built on domination, secrecy, and the deliberate destruction of human dignity. As the years stretched toward their end, the woman's life became a quiet testament to endurance in a world that had taken nearly everything from her. Time moved forward whether she was ready or not, and her body, worn down by decades of labor and repeated childbirth, could no longer keep pace with the demands placed upon it. Her steps slowed, her strength faded, and pain settled into her bones as a permanent companion. Yet even as her usefulness in the eyes of the plantation diminished, her presence remained significant in ways the system could not fully erase. She had become a living archive of suffering, memory, and unspoken truth. The plantation itself began to feel the weight of change. Rumors traveled along dirt roads and through whispered conversations, talk of laws being challenged, of abolitionists speaking openly, of a world beyond the plantation that was slowly beginning to question the morality of slavery. These rumors rarely reached the big house with urgency, but they reached the quarters quickly, carried by hope and fear in equal measure. For the woman and her children, these stories offered no clear promise, only uncertainty. Freedom, if it came, seemed distant and fragile, something to be imagined carefully, lest disappointment make survival harder. Some of her children were no longer there to witness these changes. Those sold away existed only in memory, their fates unknown. Others had died young, their bodies unable to withstand the brutal conditions imposed upon them. Each loss carved itself deeply into her heart, yet she learned to carry grief the same way she carried everything else, quietly, without ceremony. She remembered them all, speaking their names only in her thoughts, holding on to their existence as proof that they had lived, even if history would never record them properly. The children who remained grew into adulthood with an awareness that set them apart. They understood that their lives were shaped by a secret no one would ever admit. Their faces continued to mirror truth that power tried desperately to deny. Some found ways to cope through emotional distance, others through faith, others through a determination to protect whatever small spaces of dignity they could claim. None of them were untouched by anger, but anger had to be carefully managed. In a world that punished resistance, survival depended on restraint. As the woman aged, she began to be assigned lighter tasks, not out of kindness but because her body could no longer endure the hardest labor. Even this small change felt strange to her, as if the system had momentarily acknowledged her humanity without intending to. She used what little strength she had left to watch over her remaining children, offering advice born of long suffering. Her words were not filled with bitterness, but with caution, urging them to live carefully, to endure, to remember who they were, even when the world insisted they were nothing. The master's household, once rigid and confident, showed subtle signs of decay. The master himself aged into bitterness, his authority challenged by changing times and internal conflict. The brother's visits became less freak. His presence no longer as dominant as it once had been. Whether he felt guilt, fear, or simple disinterest was impossible to know. What remained undeniable was the legacy he had left behind, lives shaped by exploitation and silence. Though his name would never be officially connected to the children, the resemblance persisted, quietly mocking the lies that had sustained his power. The enslaved community began to shift as well. Younger generations spoke more openly, even if only in private, about injustice and the possibility of a different future. Songs carried coded messages of longing and resistance. Faith gatherings became spaces not just for survival, but for hope. The woman observed these changes with a mixture of cautious optimism and deep exhaustion. She had lived too long under oppression to trust fully in promises of change, yet she could not help but feel that something was stirring beyond the plantation's borders. In her final years, the woman became a figure of quiet respect among those who knew her story. Though no one spoke of it openly, there was an understanding of what she had endured and what her children represented. Younger women sought her presence, drawn to her strength and resilience. She offered them what wisdom she could, not in grand speeches but in simple truths: how to endure pain, how to protect oneself as much as possible, how to hold on to humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Her death, when it came, was unremarked upon by those in power. There was no marker, no record, no acknowledgement beyond.